A few days ago, at the time of filming, the president of Harvard University has resigned. Her name is Claudine Gay. She was made Harvard president just about 6 months ago, meaning that she has the shortest tenure of any Harvard president in history. Now, many of you were tagging me on social media wanting me to cover this story and give my thoughts, so here I am doing exactly that. You get what you ask for, but you might not like what I have to say about it. So let's get into it. So, like I said, over the holiday break, the last few weeks, I was tagged by a bunch of you on social media and asked to look at this specific case of Claudine Gay and the plagiarism accusations that have been raised against her. And honestly, I had a look at them and I just dismissed the story. I just thought it was a bunch of people who were just trying to find something on her when there's nothing really there. But next thing I know, a few days later, I get a buzz on my phone from the Ground News app. And what I see on Ground News is that the Harvard president has resigned and that there are over 200 different sources covering this story. And this turns out to be a huge story, not just a few random people on Twitter who are tagging me and stuff. And so I started to look into it a little bit more. So this is now a sponsored segment by Ground News, but it's also directly relevant to the video. So don't skip this part, otherwise the later part of the video won't make any sense. So when I look on Ground News, I can see that this story was very well covered by all sides of the political spectrum, the left, the center, and the right. And as far as I can tell from the headlines, there seem to be two main reasons why Claudine Gay was pressured into resigning. On the one side of things, there's the plagiarism scandal, which I'm going to be talking about later on in this video. And on the other side of things, there's this whole aspect of anti-Semitism. I won't get too much into the details of it, but essentially she didn't condemn a bunch of students on campus who were calling for violence against Jewish people. And she was also very evasive about questions of anti-Semitism in front of Congress.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign.
So just the anti-Semitism stuff on its own added a lot of pressure to Claudine Gay to resign, but what really seemed to tip her over the edge to actually resigning seems to be these accusations of plagiarism. And what's interesting to see on Ground News is how different publications focused on different parts of the story depending on their political bias. For example, if we look at AP News, Ground News tells me that this is a high factuality source that tends to lean left and is an independent media source, meaning that it's not owned by some large conglomerate. The headline from AP News covering this story is Harvard president resigns amid backlash from anti-Semitism testimony, strongly focusing on that anti-Semitism part of the story. However, if we look at Fox News, which obviously we know is a much more right-leaning source, then the title is Media Rush to Defend Ex-Harvard President Claudine Gay, Downplay Plagiarism and Blame Racist Conservatives. So as you can see from this headline, Fox News are strongly focusing on the plagiarism side of things rather than the anti-Semitism side of things. So while this story was very well covered by all sides of the political spectrum, not all aspects of the story were. For example, one part of this story is the fact that Claudine Gay will not be leaving Harvard University, but instead will be staying on as a professor and part of the faculty. And while she does so, she will continue to be earning a $900,000 a year salary. And that part of the story was very well covered by right-leaning media, but almost completely ignored by the left. And so by using Ground News, I can see that this is a blind spot if you're somebody who only consumes left-leaning media. But there are also stories that are blind spots for people who only consume right-leaning media. For example, this story that says that there's a report showing that data from the 2022 California traffic stops shows a pervasive pattern of racial profiling. This is a story that was hardly covered by anyone on the right side of the political spectrum, and so if you only consume right-leaning media, you would be completely not exposed to this story. So if you sign up for Ground News, you can overcome these biases. I use the Vantage plan with Ground News, both their app and their website. I literally use their service every single day, so if you want to get the Vantage plan, then be sure to use my link in the description. You'll get 30% off the Vantage plan. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to talking about Claudine Gay. So in this video, I'm going to be focusing less on the anti-Semitism side of things, just because that's not really what I cover on this channel, but instead I'm going to be focusing on the accusations of plagiarism, because that's to do with academic fraud, and that is what I cover on this channel. So let's look at the plagiarism accusations. So my main source for looking at these plagiarism accusations is the Harvard Crimson, which is the student-run newspaper at Harvard University, and as far as I could find, they're the best publication for finding the actual evidence of plagiarism that have been brought against Claudine Gay. So let's get away from the headlines and look at what the actual evidence of plagiarism actually is. So most of the accusations are centered around her doctoral dissertation. It was published in 1997, and it was called Taking Charge, Black Electoral Success and the Redefinition of American Politics. So this first paragraph that's been called into question is this one. It says, the average turnout rate seems to increase linearly as African Americans become a larger proportion of the population. This is one sign that the data contains little aggregation bias. If racial turnout rates change depending upon a precinct's racial mix, which is one way to think about bias. A linear form would be unlikely in a simple scatterplot. A linear form would only result if the changes in one race's turnout were compensated by changes in the turnout of the other race across the graph. Okay, it's a lot of words, classic academic writing, horrible to read, but you can see that the wording is actually very similar to this paragraph written by Palmquist and Stephen Voss. The average turnout rate seems to decrease linearly as African Americans become a large proportion of the population, yada yada yada. As you can see, it's very similar to Claudine Gay's paragraph. And there's actually a second paragraph in her dissertation that has been highlighted for plagiarism, again of the same paper by Palmquist and Stephen Voss. So this one says, the beginning point for any ecological inference should be the knowledge a researcher has for certain. This knowledge includes the fact that any proportion is, by definition, bound by 0 and 1. And in Palmquist and Voss's paper, they write the beginning point for any ecological inference should be with the knowledge that we have for certain. Almost from the beginning of methodological work in this area, researchers have used the fact that proportions must be, by definition, to be between 0 and 1. Now, in my opinion, in terms of like how bad the plagiarism is, the first one looks a lot worse. The second one, in my opinion, is barely plagiarism. I mean, they're talking about the exact same idea, and so obviously when you talk about the same idea or somebody else, you have to use some of the same words because you're talking about the same thing. So the fact that they both call out the 0 and 1 thing, in my opinion, is like not a big deal. You know, they're talking about the same idea. Now, the main reason why these paragraphs were highlighted and flagged as problematic is because, well, Claudine Gay didn't cite Palmquist and Voss in her paper. And so, you know, there isn't proper citation here when she's clearly drawn inspiration by reading their work. However, we have to ask the question, like, who actually are Palmquist and Voss? So it turns out that Voss is actually an associate professor and is actually somebody who taught Claudine Gay while she was at Harvard University. And when interviewed and asked about these accusations of plagiarism, Voss actually came out and said, this is technically plagiarism, but I would describe it as minor to inconsequential. And honestly, I'm inclined to agree with him. Yes, technically speaking, this is plagiarism, but like, you know, who's really getting hurt by this? The only person who would really be harmed by the result of this would be Voss, right? The person who she's copying, and he doesn't really seem to care. He thinks it's inconsequential. Now, there were other paragraphs in Claudine Gay's PhD dissertation that were also flagged as potential plagiarism. For example, this one says, Bobo and Gillum found that the African Americans in high black empowerment areas, as indicated by control of the mayor's office, are more active than either African Americans in low empowerment areas or their white counterparts of comparable socioeconomic status. Empowerment, they conclude, influences black participation by contributing to a more trusting and efficacious orientation towards politics and by greatly increasing black attentiveness to political affairs. And in Bobo and Gillum, they have very similar wording. They say are more active than either blacks living in low empowerment areas or their white counterparts of comparable socioeconomic status. Furthermore, the results show that empowerment influences black participation by contributing to a more trusting and efficacious orientation to politics and by greatly increasing black attentiveness by political affairs. As you can tell, the wording is very similar, but when interviewed, Bobo and Gillum said that they did not feel that Gay was plagiarizing their work. In fact, Bobo, who is the Dean of Social Science at Harvard, went on to say he is unconcerned about these claims as our work was explicitly acknowledged. And I totally agree. I mean, she literally says Bobo and Gillum found that at the start of the paragraph. And so it's very obvious, you know, where that idea has come from. You know, plagiarism is problematic, but the essence of plagiarism is trying to pass off somebody else's ideas as your own. That's when plagiarism becomes really problematic. But clearly, Gay has cited who she's getting the idea from. And so personally, I don't really see any harm here. Now, 1997 was a long time ago. I mean, I wasn't even born yet. So let's look at some more recent accusations, because there were some accusations of plagiarism in her more recent work. For example, this paragraph is from a Claudine Gay paper that she wrote in 2017. And it says, what began as a modest item in the Internal Revenue Code has evolved over time into the nation's single largest subsidy for affordable housing, replacing nearly all previous tax incentives for investing in rental housing of any kind. And in Alex F. Schwartz 2010, they say something similar. So they say the low-income housing tax credit has evolved from an esoteric financial instrument, blah, 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 blah. And then later on in the paragraph, they say the tax credit replaced virtually all previous tax incentives for investing in rental housing of any kind. So again, the wording is very similar. You know, that last part is literally word for word the same. But the Crimson reports that, you know, his work was cited at the end of the subsequent sentence in Gay's article. So again, she is citing her sources. I mean, yes, if she's going to be using their wording exactly, she should be putting them in quotation marks to show that she is quoting them exactly. But, you know, she is citing her sources. She's not trying to pass these things off as her own, unique idea. And this is another paragraph, again from that 2017 article, where she says, I also construct a county level measure that captures the financial incentives developers have to build or rehabilitate affordable housing. And then there's a paper by Friedman and Emily Owens where they say, we construct a county level measure that captures the incentives developers have to build or rehabilitate affordable housing. Right, quite similar. She has put the word financial in there, so it is slightly different, but it's it's very, very similar. But again, when interviewed, both Schwartz, who we talked about in the previous paragraph, and Owens, who we're talking about in this paragraph, they both told the Crimson that they do not consider Gay's use of their work to be plagiarism. Schwartz writes to the Crimson, in my opinion, this excerpt in no way constitutes any resemblance to plagiarism. And Owens, who wrote the second paragraph, said, Gay's adoption of such short phrases did not amount to taking credit for another's writing or ideas. So, what do I make of Claudine Gay's plagiarism scandal? It's small potatoes. It's really, really small potatoes, right? This is not a big deal. Compared to the other stuff that we've talked about on this channel, we talked about, for example, Joachim Bolt, who was faking entire medical studies and whose work was used as part of meta-analyses that were used to justify the use of dangerous substances in medical surgery and probably resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people. Like, that is proper academic fraud. Like, that is problematic things in the academic system. This, like quoting a few small sentences in a massive PhD dissertation or in a huge, paper, this is small potatoes. This is not a big deal. Like, literally no one is getting hurt. The only person who would potentially be hurt by this are the people who she is quoting from, and even they are writing to the Crimson being like, we don't care. Like, this is not a big deal. This is not plagiarism. Most of the time she is actually citing who she's talking about. She just maybe should have been more clear that she's using their more exact wording, but like, come on, like, this is small potatoes. I'll be honest with you guys, when I was at university, I did plagiarism that was like way worse than this. And yes, I was told off for it by my professor, who said that, I should be using quotation marks if I'm going to be quoting things more directly, or I shouldn't really be quoting anything at all, but trying to reword things as much as possible. Yes, that is like the proper academic process. Technically, this is plagiarism, but like, is it a big deal? Like I said, we're talking about a few really small paragraphs in a really long dissertation. Like, she's not trying to pass off these really grand ideas as, her own independent thoughts. She's clearly citing the people that she's talking about. It's not a big deal. Like, this, to me, this is really not a big deal. But like I said, this story has two sides to it, right? There's the anti-Semitism stuff, and then there's this plagiarism stuff. And in the media, they seem to give both of them, pretty much equal weight. And I think that the anti-Semitism stuff seems to be way worse than this plagiarism stuff. I mean, like, this to me really doesn't seem like a big deal at all. Like, in the whole spectrum of academic fraud, this is on the very low impact side of the spectrum. To be clear, I'm not saying that I agree with everything that Claudine Gay says. I'm certainly not in favor of anti-Semitism, obviously. But as far as academic fraud goes, as far as the impact and the harm that can be caused from academic fraud, this plagiarism stuff is... it's not a big deal, guys. It's not. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for watching today's video. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring today's video. Remember, use my code in the description for 30% off the Vantage plan. And subscribe if you want more content. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.